out-of-control sexual behavior.
Whether you call it sexual addiction, sexual compulsivity, hypersexual behavior,
it can have devastating consequences on one's life.
Consequences they may never have imagined for themselves, their families, their friends, and their careers, every area of life.
Research indicates that 3 to 5% of the United States population
could meet the criteria for sexual addiction and compulsivity.
These numbers are based on individuals who seek treatment. Though this is a large number of people,
it is probably a conservative estimate.
Like most diseases, more people suffer from this disorder than actually seek treatment.
This disease is not just a male problem, but a human problem. It affects both men and women.
This is an issue of suffering.
Sexual addiction and compulsivity, or hypersexual disorder,
is an issue of public health, mental health, and risk.
As long as this disease process is undiagnosed,
misunderstood, and overlooked,
it remains out of the line of sight.
Out of the light of day.
It places people of all ages, gender,
creed, race, locale
in silent danger.
The good news, treatment is available.
Treatment works.
For nearly 3 decades, men and women
have entered recovery for sexual addiction and compulsivity.
Their lives have been redeemed and restored.
Their families have been able to heal.
There is life after this disease.
There is help.
And there is hope.
There is a lot unknown about sex addiction. In fact, we still don't agree on the name. However, what we do know is that it is a disorder that can affect everyone: men, women, straight, gay, and it's found in almost every ethnic group. The origins of this disorder are most likely a complex interaction of biological, psychological, and environmental factors. Changes in the brain, genetics, trauma, early life experiences have all been implicated. Each person has their own story, but the story is the same. This is a real problem that affects real people.
Sexual addiction is a process addiction. And what that means is they don't have to ingest any chemicals in order to create the high. So oftentimes we'll see a progression with the behaviors for more intensity, more danger, etc. We also look for consequences.
Okay.
What have these behaviors done to you in your life, the loved ones who are around you? Have you missed opportunities in your career or your education that have cost you time or energy or success?
Well, I don't particularly care much what it's called, because I don't believe it's about sex. It just happens to be the behavior of choice that helps people to manage their feelings. You know, all addictions and compulsive behaviors are about managing feelings. And one of the things that characterizes an addict is an inability to self-soothe and to self-regulate. And like gambling, eating, drinking, drugging, sex helps people to do that.
Well, I think we have a major difficulty in defining what healthy sexuality is. And then the whole notion of sexual addiction and compulsivity encompasses a broad range of behaviors, from simply pursuing relationships compulsively to isolated compulsive masturbation and everything in between. And then it infringes on other people's rights, other people's lives, families, and so forth. So it's really a very complex topic. And then to try to narrow that down to diagnostic criteria of what needs treatment is extremely difficult.
What starts an addiction doesn't necessarily maintain an addiction. If I asked you why you started smoking when you were 15 years old, you might say because it was cool, because my friends were doing it, because I thought it looked manly, I thought it was sophisticated. Whatever your reasons may be, if I say, why are you still doing it at 40 years old? You're not going to say, because I think it's cool, because my friends are doing it. So regardless of what was the initial beginning of that behavior, it does not necessarily mean that today, 10 years, 20 years later, that that's maintaining the behavior still.
Now we're hearing lots of terms. We hear sex addiction, we hear disorder, we hear disease. You use the term disorder. What's the difference and why do you prefer disorder?
I think I'd prefer the term disorder because unlike a disease where we can specify very closely a certain agent and an environment and the damage that that agent does to the environment, whether it be a virus, cells that are replicating out of control, bacteria, a disorder is a constellation of symptoms that have a root, most likely, actually definitely, in neurochemistry. At this point in time, we don't know what those roots are, but we know that there are genetic, neurochemical basis that leads to a constellation of symptoms, and that then gives us a disorder that we can then, at this point in time, describe, even though we may not have the pathophysiologic mechanisms clearly understood.
An addiction is a pathological or unhealthy relationship with a substance or a behavior that a person does, even in the face of negative consequences.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the DSM? We know that sex addiction, compulsivity, whatever we might want to call it, is not in the DSM, and that affects a lot. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the progress of getting this disorder put into the DSM is probably one of the more important things that we can focus on. What the DSM allows is a systemized, categorized way of looking at this disorder. It's not to throw labels, it's not to pigeonhole, but it's a way so that if I'm talking to a therapist across the country, we're on the same page. And we know that we're on the same page because we're using criteria that through the research literature has been substantiated through a variety of different studies, whether they be biologic studies, sociodemographic studies, observational studies. The point is, the DSM tries to capture that and provide consistent criteria so that we have some form of validity for the diagnosis.
For some people, putting a label on it brings intense shame, and yet for other people, being able to say, hey, there is a disorder and it has this name, suddenly it brings hope to them. From that point, they think, hey, this is not just me being a person of poor character or having bad morals. There's actually something wrong, and if there's something wrong, I can get help.
Sex addiction and all addiction is a brain disease. And as we begin to explore our understanding of neuroscience and we have the ability to do more research, we're seeing more and more that addictive disorders are not moral failures. They are diseases.
I think understanding how intensely the brain is involved is key. Because for a drive that feels so good, sexual arousal feels good. Absolutely. And so understanding how prevalent that is in everyday life, how difficult that struggle is, and matching that with the brain and what it is doing is essential in terms of making sure that we're treating the whole person and the whole process and not one or two specific behaviors. I think the label we put on it is less important than the goals of healthy recovery and a healthy lifestyle, being able to be free of the bondage and the binds that they put themselves in and eliminate the consequences. If we put a good label on it, if we have a number to attach to it, that's really convenient and that makes the process easier, but I think that it doesn't change the treatment significantly.
The consequences of this disorder can touch all aspects of one's life. These can include loss of friends, social isolation, loss of income, loss of job advancement, arrest, loss of licensure, sexually transmitted disease including HIV, pregnancy, loss of family, child custody issues, loss of marriage or partner, loss of time with children, depression, anxiety, guilt, shame, self-loathing, lack of connection, embarrassment, poor academic or job performance, and the list goes on.
In my own life, I had been having affairs and acting out with people. I was a flight attendant, and it was really easy for me to have a separate life that was totally secret. He had no way of knowing what was going on. And, that was a part of my history, and I got to the place where I had no, my value system was inherited. It wasn't holding me up. And I ended up having no integrity at that point. And you know, the good news is I feel like the God of my understanding intervened on me and said, cut it out. You can't keep doing this. You got to get honest.
I think the biggest hurdle people have is they have so much shame attached to this. Unlike you know, having depression, being able to go and talk to someone about sexual acting out is very shame-based. Very much like alcoholism was 50, 60 years ago. We have so many moral judgments on people's behavior that shame keeps people from getting help.
Many times people come in and they want to know, why am I doing this? And there's such a variety of reasons. And research has shown that approximately 84 to 86% of all the, at least the men that we work with, have had early history of trauma. And in cases of trauma, we find that people on an unconscious level repeat the trauma. They just keep repeating it and repeating it, I think with a hope of mastering the trauma.
What about female sex addicts? They look different than male sex addicts?
Well, they have a lot of things that are very similar. I think what we see with female sex addicts is that most often the relationship issue is a huge one. A lot of times people talk about love addiction and or relationship addiction instead of sex addiction. That's not to say that there aren't women who don't use sex in some of the similar ways that we traditionally see men to use it. Access to sexuality that we have with the internet now, whether it's pornography or hooking up with somebody or going online with cameras, and we see women engaging more and more in behaviors that get to be addictive in nature. And so while we used to say only about 10% of those folks that we see were women, we see those numbers coming up and up and up.
When we start trying to separate it out, I look for, how is this interfering with your life? How is it disrupting your goals for your life, for your family, and for your career? And from there, we can usually find the difficulty that needs to be addressed.
If you feel like what you've heard so far applies to you or someone you care about, you may want to find someone who is trained to talk to. The first place you may want to look is sash.net. The Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health provides a list of trained individuals, groups, and other resources. There are many forms of potential treatment. Someone who is trained can help you choose what is best for you.
I know in my own journey, I was totally broken. I was diagnosed with cervical cancer caused by a sexually transmitted disease, had multiple surgeries, I lost a marriage, and my life totally fell apart. And for me, I felt hope when I dared to tell my story to another woman. She wasn't a clinician, she was just a friend. And all she said was, "Oh, Marnie, I am so sorry." That's it, just, I'm sorry. She heard me in my worst moment, and she accepted me. And I thought, ah. And then when I walked into a therapist's office and I told the story again, and she said, "I know what this is, and I can help you. And there's a whole body of literature that's being written about this." And I thought, okay, someone knows how to help.
And you begin to feel not so alone.
And I began to feel not so alone.
The greatest resource is sash.net, the list of people who are in the organization who understand addiction and compulsion.
And there at that website, people can find not only information about the disorder, but they can find treatment professionals, treatment providers.
So what do you suggest for people when they're looking for a therapist? What questions would be helpful for them to ask the therapist?
Well, certainly to find somebody who has some experience with this and some specific training.
I would ask a therapist, are you a member of SASH? Are you a member of ITAP? Have you received good clinical training in this area? What's your model of addiction? What is your model of sexuality? Do you view this as a behavior-based disorder, as a brain disorder, as a trauma disorder? All of the above, something else. How many others have you treated for sexual addiction or sexual compulsivity? Are you a neophyte at this, or is this a focus of your practice?
And what about the internet as a resource?
The internet's a double-edged sword. because if you look up sex addiction, you're equally likely to get a whole list of sex sites as you are to get sexual health. And I think that's one of the greatest difficulties, because it's so readily available in terms of the things that they don't need. It's sifting through and finding the things that they really do need and the resources that they do need. It's sometimes difficult.
I think people empower themselves by asking questions, asking about financial resources. How much is it going to cost? Do you have sliding fee scales if you're financially strapped? Do you take insurance? All those types of questions are fair questions. I also encourage people, though, to realize that you're interviewing someone in this process, and that you may not necessarily go with the first person you meet. It's okay as a clinician if I have someone who asks, I would like to meet with you to see if we fit in terms of our personalities, in terms of feeling safe. The first person you meet may not be that person, and that's okay.
I guess my best advice to the sex addict is to get help now. Don't delay. These are such painful matters, and people report after even the assessment, that I've told my story to you for the first time, or I've said things here today that I've never told anybody before in my life. And just the act of doing that creates a tremendous amount of relief and a dissipation of shame. And that's one of the most healing things a person can do, is to get help immediately.
I think it's critical in the beginning to work individually, to get your feet under you, to get an understanding of what's going on, to get your story out and understand your story, to begin some level of recovery. So if you can't do more than that, start there.
As the individual who struggles with this, or the clinician who's trying to help that person, we need to know that talking about this issue is the key to freedom.
I think the toughest part of treatment is helping the recovering sex addict or hypersexual person to understand that that behavior has to stop, but the goal is not deprivation. So coming out of that notion that this is not about deprivation, this is about learning how to eliminate the dysfunctional behavior and consequences, and eventually replace it with something that's much more positive.
So you, like others, have mentioned that this is a long process. So we've heard 3 to 5 years, 2 to 5 years.
It is a long process, but that doesn't mean you're going to be in therapy every week for the next 3 to 5 years. That doesn't mean that you're going to be struggling every day for the next 3 to 5 years to keep from going back to those problematic behaviors. But it does mean that there's a great deal of work that takes place, concentrated work, in the first 3 to 5 years. And then after that, I believe there needs to be vigilance for the rest of a person's life.
I believe that the most helpful thing you can do would be to talk about what you most don't want us to know. That was true in my life when I was a client, and frequently, literally every week, somebody will pick up on that and say, okay, you said, we'll point over, you said, talk about what I don't want to talk about, and I need to do that. And maybe it's been triggered because somebody else had shared something that they didn't think anybody else would do, but just a reduction, and that comes from just being open in the area of sharing with the group.
It's what we call a process group, where people are really talking about their feelings, how each other are impacted by the other. So there's an opportunity to really learn what it means to set boundaries, to understand how, for example, I behave in relation to you, and if you do something that offends me or hurts me, we have an opportunity to sort it out with a group of people that are supporting us.
And ideally, for those just beginning, is to get them into some kind of 12-step group, whether Sexaholics Anonymous or Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. There's plenty of opportunity in most communities now to enter into some kind of group forum. It's important for that individual to identify a sponsor, somebody that can come alongside of them and help them to work through the 12 steps.
You can typically find somebody that has similar story to you or has similar life situation, and they can be there for you 24 hours a day, typically. Most people talk to their sponsor at least once a day initially.
Is there one 12-step recovery program that's more suited or aimed at the gay population than another?
Sexual Compulsive Anonymous, SCA, came out of that need for LGBT people to have a space to express themselves to be comfortable. It's not limited to LGBT people, but it is the place designed for that openness and the flexibility. And in most areas where SCA is active, that's where people tend to gravitate.
I think that intensives provide an opportunity for close bonding and expedite the process. So when someone gets an intensive, they're doing a full day of therapeutic activity. Their focus is on getting well. They're not distracted for that period of time from work and groceries and broken water heaters and life that happens. But going away and focusing on an intensive, the person has an opportunity to expedite the process of recovery.
If a person can't manage their sexual sobriety, as we call it, in an outpatient setting, then it's often a good idea to go into an intensive outpatient program or into a hospital setting.
It's one of the most nurturing things you can do for yourself when you're at that point in life where you're not managing life.
It's really important that the family gets help for themselves.
Right, because they've been traumatized too.
They have been traumatized, and it's just painful. And as the addicted person gets better, then the family members may find themselves now dealing with their own experience because the focus has changed.
Right. Bringing in the partner and spouse is very important early on. To have that person aware of what's going on, even though terrifying, and oftentimes there's a lot of reactivity with that, trying to keep that a secret and be in recovery perpetuates the very same thing that brought the addict in the first place, of having secrecy, of keeping things from those that they love and care about.
And for the partner to understand that this is a road that they have to walk down together. Oftentimes the partner will say, well, this is your problem and you should go get help and I didn't do this. But the truth is there's a system, and that system includes the partner and even children. So if somebody decides to stay with their partner who's a sex addict, they usually say they stay because they love the person. And if they love the person, they have to get into their own treatment as well. And they have to make it something that they do together and view it as a positive, not a negative.
I've been surprised, actually, over the years that we've never had within the family somebody drumming out a member of the family because a person was honest about dastardly deeds and horrible things they've done.
I guess the thing that I hear first is there any hope? I tell clients that, my job is to tell you on day one that there is hope. Ultimately, that the goal is to lead them to freedom, but freedom doesn't come on day one. Hope can come on day one. Hope that they can stop their behavior, whatever it is.
With a trained clinician, they can sit down and really tell their stories and not feel the shame. In fact, what they're going to feel is a sense of relief. They're going to feel a sense of safety. They're going to feel like they have a way out. And that is one of the most important things, is that aspect of hope.
There will always be something that we can't resolve and that there will be a longing for. So becoming comfortable with that notion that culturally it's not black and white. I don't have to fix all the problems. I have to deal with myself, and I have to do what is in balance for me, and let other people be comfortable or uncomfortable as they choose.
So at times, Bill, somebody will ask that, in fact, frequently, do you actually believe that you can help? Not can Ralph help, can we in our field do something that can make a difference, and to be able to say, yeah, that we can, and it's nothing magical, and it does require, I look at it, a partnership with therapists and the client, that if you do your part and I do mine, then we can actually make some progress and begin to see things be different.
While the thought of getting help is daunting and terrifying, but the payoff is something that is likely beyond a person's wildest dreams.
The wonderful thing about going through a recovery process with sexual addiction is you can have a rich, fulfilling life in a way that many people don't touch on during their lifetime experience.
And so it's not just repairing their whole lives, but actually improving them.
That's right. It's the resurrection experience, that it's about rebirth and being able to really look at what's next. Where to from here, God?
People have transformed their lives. I mean, truly have transformed their lives from what it was to something better.